Growth and Conflict, 1816 to 1877. Did you know political parties are important to democratic governments? Political parties nominate candidates for public office and select issues for public debate. There are no strict requirements for membership in political parties in the United States. A person is considered a member of the political party in which they want to belong. The early years of the Republic. In 1789, Congress created the Department of State, the Department of the Treasury, the Department of War, and the Office of the Attorney General. Washington then chose his cabinet, the individuals who would head these departments and advise him. The judicial branches, as well as the first federal judges, were established with the Judiciary Act of 1789. John Jay became the first Chief Justice of the United States. In 1791, 10 amendments to the Constitution went into effect. These amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, offered safeguards for individual rights against actions of the federal government. The Ninth Amendment states that people have rights other than the ones listed. The 10th Amendment states that any powers not specifically listed to the federal government would be reserved for states. To help ease the debt amassed by the Continental Congress, Alexander Hamilton wanted the federal government to take responsibility for the state's debt and create a national bank. Opponents of a national bank said that establishing such a bank was not an enumerated power, a power specifically mentioned in the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton said the necessary and proper clause created implied powers, or powers not listed in the Constitution, but necessary for the government to function. A national bank was needed to collect taxes, regulate trade, and provide for defense. In 1791, Hamilton's proposed high tax on the manufacture of American whiskey passed in Congress. Western farmers were outraged by the 25% tax, and in 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion began. Washington sent in 13,000 troops to stop the rebellion. The split in Congress over Hamilton's financial plan resulted in the formation of two political parties. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, wanted a strong national government in the hands of the wealthy. They believed in manufacturing and trade as the basis of wealth and power. Artisans, merchants, manufacturers, and bankers supported the Federalist Party. Madison and Jefferson led the Democratic Republicans. Their party was referred to as the Republicans. The group supported agriculture over trade and commerce. They favored the rights of states against the power of the federal government. The rural South and West tended to support Republicans. Washington was succeeded after 2 terms as president by fellow Federalist John Adams. The Federalists, in a move to silence Republican criticism against them, passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. It was now a crime to criticize the federal government and federal officials. Also, the laws made it harder for aliens who typically voted Republican to gain citizenship. In 1798 and 1799, the laws were challenged by Kentucky and Virginia, who stated they were unconstitutional. The election of 1800 was closely contested and revealed a flaw in the system for selecting a president. Each state chooses electors that are sent to the Electoral College to vote for the president. In the election of 1800, 2 candidates, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, each had the same number of electoral votes. According to the Constitution, the House of Representatives votes for president when there is a tie. However, there was also a tie in the House of Representatives. Finally, Jefferson became president by 1 vote. The election of 1800 proved that despite disagreements between political parties, power in the United States could be peacefully transferred.
Question: why was the election of 1800 an important turning point in American history? The answer: the election of 1800 proved that despite disagreements between political parties, power in the United States could be peacefully transferred.
The Republicans take power. Thomas Jefferson wanted to limit the scope of government. He began paying off the federal debt, cut government spending, and did away with the whiskey tax. He also trimmed the armed forces. On his last day in office, Adams appointed dozens of Federalist judges and court officers. Jefferson asked the new Republican Congress to not allow the last-minute appointments. The Supreme Court agreed with Jefferson. In Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court asserted its right of judicial review, or the power to decide whether laws passed by Congress were constitutional and strike down laws that were not. By 1803, Napoleon began plans to conquer Europe. Short on funds, Napoleon agreed to sell the Louisiana Territory as well as New Orleans to the United States. On April 30th, 1803, the United States purchased Louisiana from France for $11.25 million and took on French debts of about $3.75 million. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States. When Madison took office in 1809, he faced growing tensions with Great Britain. The British were seizing American ships and kidnapping American sailors, and they were accused of inciting Native Americans to attack white settlers. Economic sanctions were beginning to work, but too late. Congress had declared war, and the War of 1812 began. The British marched into Washington, D.C. and burned the White House and Capitol, but faced strong opposition in Baltimore. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24, 1814, restored pre-war boundaries, generated patriotism and national unity, and destroyed the Federalist Party, whose members had opposed the war. The growth of American nationalism. Republican President James Monroe was greeted with a spreading sense of nationalism and political harmony. The focus shifted to domestic issues. Congress prepared an ambitious economic program. Their program included creating a new national bank, protecting American manufacturers from foreign competition, and improving transportation in order to link the country together. Between 1816 and 1824, Chief Justice of the United States John Marshall ruled in several cases that established the power of the federal government over the states. In the 1819 decision of McCulloch v. Maryland, Marshall said that the Second Bank was constitutional because the necessary and proper clause meant that the federal government could use any method for carrying out its powers as long as the method was not expressly forbidden in the Constitution. He also ruled that state governments could not interfere with an agency of the federal government exercising its specific constitutional powers within a state. In the 1824 decision of Givens v. Ogden, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution granted the federal government control over interstate commerce. Marshall's decisions expanded federal power with the help of the Necessary and Proper Clause and the Interstate Commerce Clause. Nationalism in the United States influenced the nation to expand its borders and assert itself in world affairs. In the early 1800s, Spanish-held Florida angered many Southerners because runaway slaves fled there and because the Seminoles often clashed with American settlers across the border in Georgia. In 1818, General Andrew Jackson seized Spanish settlements in Florida. In the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, Spain ceded all of Florida to the United States. Many of Spain's colonies on the American mainland were declaring independence. Some European monarchies proposed helping Spain regain control of its overseas colonies. In response, President Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine. This policy declared that the United States would prevent other countries from interfering in Latin American political affairs.
Question: how did the Supreme Court decisions establish the power of the federal government over state governments? The answer: McCulloch v. Maryland said that the federal government could use the necessary improper clause for carrying out its powers. The decision in this case also said that state governments could not interfere with an agency of the federal government exercising its specific constitutional powers within a state. Gibbons v. Ogden ruled that the Constitution granted the federal government control over interstate commerce, including all trade along the coast or waterways dividing states.
A growing nation. In the early 1800s, a transportation revolution and the Industrial Revolution helped the North become a major manufacturing center. In 1806, Congress funded a major east-west highway called the National Road. Steamboats made river travel more reliable and upstream travel possible. Railroads appeared in the 1800s. Trains helped settle the West and expand trade among regions. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the 1700s. The revolution consisted of several developments in business and industry. The United States industrialized quickly. The key factor may have been the American system of free enterprise based on private property rights. Industrialization began in the Northeast. Eli Whitney popularized the use of interchangeable parts, which led to factory-based production. Samuel F. B. Morse perfected the telegraph and developed Morse code, which sped communication. Industrialization and the search for higher-paying jobs drew thousands from rural areas into the cities. Immigrants by the millions poured into the United States between 1815 and 1860. Some immigrants became farmers, others provided a steady stream of cheap labor. Some Americans organized against the newcomers. These nativists had a preference for native-born people and wanted to limit immigration. They formed the American Party, which became known as the Know-Nothings. Factory workers, which included women and children, were poorly paid and worked under horrid conditions. Some workers began to organize into labor unions, or groups of workers who pressed for better working conditions and member benefits. Despite industrialization, agriculture remained the country's leading economic activity, especially in the South. In the South, cotton was king and accounted for nearly 2/3 of U.S. exports. However, the South accounted for only about 16% of U.S. manufacturing. The success of cotton and the growth of plantations greatly increased the demand for slave labor. The slave trade was outlawed in 1808, but a high birth rate among enslaved women kept the population growing. By 1850, enslaved Africans comprised 37% of the total Southern population. All enslaved persons suffered indignities ranging from a complete lack of citizenship and political rights to extreme violence and murder. Free African Americans lived in both the North and the South. They were not embraced in either region, but in the North they could organize their own churches and associations and earn money from jobs.
Question: why did some factory workers organize labor unions? The answer: labor unions were groups of organized workers who fought for better working conditions and benefits for their members.
Did you know, until the presidential election of 2000, John Adams and John Quincy Adams had been the only father-son presidents? In 2000, George W. Bush was elected the 43rd President of the United States. His father, George Bush, had been the country's 41st president. The resurgence of sectionalism. In 1819, Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state. This set off the divisive issue as to whether slavery should expand westward. The Union had 11 free states and 11 slave states. Admitting any new state, either slave or free, would upset the balance of political power in the Senate. The Missouri Compromise called for admitting Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. An amendment was added to the compromise that prohibited slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of Missouri's southern border. Henry Clay steered the compromise, and the House of Representatives accepted it. Four Republican candidates ran for president in 1824, indicating the strong sectionalism within the Republican Party. Jackson won the popular vote, but no candidate won a majority in the Electoral College. The election then went to the House of Representatives to select the president from the three candidates with the highest number of electoral votes. Clay was eliminated, so he threw his support to John Quincy Adams. Adams won the House vote. Jackson's supporters accused Adams and Clay of a corrupt bargain in which Clay was accused of winning votes for Adams in return for the cabinet post of Secretary of State. Jackson and his supporters took the name Democratic Republicans, later shortened to Democrats. Adams and his followers became known as National Republicans. In the early 1800s, many states eliminated property ownership as a qualification for voting. As a result, hundreds of thousands of white males gained the right to vote. The presidential candidates for the election of 1828 were John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. The candidates resorted to mudslinging, criticizing each other's personalities and morals. Jackson won the election of 1828. Many voters who supported him were from the West and South, rural and small-town men who thought Jackson would represent their interests. President Jackson believed in the participation of the average citizen in government. He supported the spoils system, the practice of appointing people to government jobs on the basis of party loyalty and support. He believed that this practice extended democracy and opened up the government to average citizens. To make the political system more democratic, President Jackson supported a new way in which presidential candidates were chosen. At that time, they were chosen through a closed meeting or caucus in which congressional party members would choose the nominee. Jackson's supporters replaced this system with the National Nominating Convention. Under this system, delegates from the states met at conventions to choose the party's presidential nominee. In the early 1800s, South Carolina's economy was weakening, and many people blamed the nation's tariffs. South Carolina purchased most of its manufactured goods from England, and the high tariffs made these goods expensive. When Congress levied a new tariff in 1828, called the Tariff of Abominations by critics, South Carolina threatened to secede or withdraw from the Union. John C. Calhoun, the nation's vice president, was torn between supporting the nation's policies and supporting fellow South Carolinians. Instead of supporting secession, he proposed the idea of nullification. This idea argued that because states had created the federal union, they had the right to declare a federal law null or not valid. The issue of nullification erupted again in 1830 in a debate between Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina and Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts on the Senate floor. Hayne defended states' rights, while Webster defended the Union. President Jackson defended the Union. After Congress passed another tariff law in 1832, South Carolina called a special convention that declared the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 unconstitutional. Jackson considered the declaration an act of treason. After Senator Henry Clay pushed through a bill that would lower tariffs gradually until 1842, South Carolina repealed its nullification of the tariff law. Slavery remained a divisive issue. However, Jackson largely ignored the issue, focusing instead on Native Americans. President Jackson supported the idea of moving all Native Americans out of the way of white settlers. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, which helped the states relocate Native Americans to uninhabited regions west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee in Georgia fought the Indian Removal Act by appealing to the Supreme Court. In Cherokee Nation v. Georgia 1831 and Worcester v. Georgia 1832, Chief Justice Marshall supported the Cherokees' right to control their land. President Jackson refused to support the decision. In 1838, Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, sent in an army to force the remaining Cherokee out of Georgia. Thousands of Cherokee died on the journey that became known as the Trail of Tears. Although most Americans supported the removal policy, some members of Congress and a few religious denominations condemned it. President Jackson opposed the Second Bank of the United States, regarding it as a benefit only to the wealthy. At the time, the bank was instrumental in keeping the nation's money supply stable. Many Western settlers who needed easy credit opposed the bank's policies. President Jackson believed the bank was unconstitutional, even though the Supreme Court ruled otherwise. President Jackson vetoed a bill that would extend the charter of the bank for another 20 years. During the 1832 presidential election, President Jackson opposed the bank. He removed the government's deposits from the bank, forcing it to call in its loans and stop lending. By the mid-1830s, a new political party called the Whigs formed to oppose President Jackson. Many members were former National Republicans whose party had fallen apart. Unlike Jackson's Democrats, Whigs advocated expanding the federal government and encouraging commercial development. The Whigs could not settle on one presidential candidate in the 1836 election. As a result, they ran three candidates. Jackson's popularity and the nation's continued economic prosperity helped Democrat Martin Van Buren win. However, shortly after Van Buren took office, the country experienced an economic crisis known as the Panic of 1837. Thousands of farmers lost their land in foreclosures, and unemployment soared. The Whigs saw the economic crisis as an opportunity to defeat the Democrats. In the 1840 election, they nominated General William Henry Harrison for president and John Tyler, a former Democrat, for vice president. The Whig candidate defeated Van Buren. However, Harrison died 1 month after his inauguration, and Tyler then succeeded to the presidency. Tyler actually opposed many Whig policies and sided with the Democrats on issues such as refusing to support a new national bank or a higher tariff. President Tyler did establish a firm boundary between the United States and Canada in the 1842 Webster-Ashburton Treaty.
Question: what issue helped the Whig candidate win the presidency in 1840? The answer: the economic crisis of 1837.
The Reform Spirit. In the mid-1800s, many Americans worked to reform various aspects of society. Dorothea Dix worked for improved treatment of the mentally ill. Religious leaders organized to revive the nation's commitment to religion in a movement known as the Second Great Awakening. An important advocate of this movement was Charles G. Finney, who helped found modern revivalism. A number of new religious denominations emerged from the new religious revival. These included the Unitarians and the Universalists. Joseph Smith founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, whose followers are known as the Mormons. After being harassed, the Mormons moved to Illinois. After the murder of Joseph Smith and continued persecution, the Mormons settled in Utah. Lyman Beecher was instrumental in establishing associations known as benevolent societies. Although they were first begun to spread God's teaching, these societies also sought to combat social problems. Women were particularly active in the revivalist movement and became extremely active in the religious-based reform groups. Many reformers argued that excessive use of alcohol was one of the major causes of crime and poverty. These reformers advocated temperance or abstinence from alcohol. Several temperance groups joined together in 1833 to form the American Temperance Union. Temperance groups also pushed for laws to prohibit the sale of liquor. Some reformers focused on improving prison conditions in the nation. Others advocated for better schools. In the 1800s, men generally went to work, while women took care of the house and children. Most people at the time believed that home was the proper place for women. Many women saw themselves as partners with their husbands. Many women began to believe that they had an important role to improve society. Some began to argue that they needed greater rights to promote their roles. Other women also argued that equal rights for men and women would end many social injustices. In 1848, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the Seneca Falls Convention, a meeting to focus on equal rights for women and one that marked the beginning of the women's movement. The statement they distributed, the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, called attention to their cause. Throughout the 1850s, women organized more conventions to promote greater rights for women. The movement calling for abolition, or the immediate end of slavery, polarized the nation and contributed to the Civil War. Many Americans had opposed slavery, and there had been opposition to slavery since the Revolutionary War. Some anti-slavery societies believed that the best solution was to send African Americans back to Africa. Some societies formed the American Colonization Society, ACS, to move African Americans to Africa. The ACS acquired land in West Africa, chartered ships, and moved some free African Americans to a colony in West Africa that eventually became the nation of Liberia. Colonization, however, was not a realistic solution. Also, most African Americans regarded the United States as their home and had no desire to migrate to another continent. In the 1830s, the development of a large national abolitionist movement was largely due to the work of William Lloyd Garrison. He founded The Liberator, an anti-slavery newspaper. With an increasing following, he founded the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. He called for emancipation, or freeing of enslaved persons. Free African Americans also played a prominent role in the abolitionist movement. The most prominent was Frederick Douglass, who published his own anti-slavery newspaper, The North Star. Sojourner Truth was another important African American abolitionist. Many Northerners, even those who disapproved of slavery, opposed abolitionism, viewing it as a threat to the existing social system. Many warned that it would produce conflict between the North and the South. Others feared a possible huge influx of African Americans to the North. Still others feared that abolition would destroy the Southern economy and thereby affect their own economy. Most Southerners viewed slavery as essential to their economy and therefore opposed abolition. Some defended slavery by claiming that most enslaved people had no desire for freedom because they benefited from their relationship with their slaveholders. In 1831, a revolt by enslaved people killed more than 50 white Virginians. Southerners demanded the suppression of all abolitionist publications. Southern postal workers refused to deliver such publications, and the House of Representatives, under pressure from the South, shelved all abolitionist petitions. The North-South split continued to widen. Question: what was the Northern reaction to the abolitionist movement? The answer: many Northerners opposed abolitionism, fearing that it would disrupt the social system. Some feared that it would result in an influx of African Americans. Others feared that abolition would destroy the Southern economy. Did you know the Mormon Church and its founder Joseph Smith were forced to move several times to escape religious persecution? Many people disliked the new religion, partly because of its teachings that a man could have more than one wife. The Mormons moved to Ohio, then to Missouri, then to Illinois. They built a prosperous community at Nauvoo, Illinois. In 1844, Joseph Smith was jailed for ordering his followers to destroy a printing press. The people who owned the press had disagreed with Smith. An angry mob killed Smith and his brother. Manifest Destiny. Fertile soil, the fur trade, and trade with foreign nations lured immigrants west. Many Americans believed in manifest destiny, the idea that the nation was meant to spread to the Pacific. Immigrants were attracted to Oregon and California, although parts of these lands were claimed by other nations, Great Britain and Oregon, and Mexico and California. By the 1840s, several east to west routes had been carved: the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and the Santa Fe Trail. As traffic on the trails increased, so did the hostility of Plains Indians. To avoid conflict, the Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed in 1851. Plains Indians agreed to set geographic boundaries in exchange for those lands belonging to them forever. The Mexican government had encouraged American settlement in Texas, which was part of Mexico since 1821. However, Mexico closed its borders in 1830 due to the failure of Americans to accept the conditions of settlement, which the Mexican government would not negotiate. Americans defeated Mexican forces at the Battle of San Jacinto in 1836. 5 months later, the citizens of Texas voted in favor of annexation, absorption by the United States as a slave state. Because of anti-slavery opposition and Mexico's claims on Texas, President Jackson made no move toward annexation. In the presidential election of 1844, Texas statehood was a key issue. The Whig candidate Henry Clay supported annexation. Anti-slavery Whigs felt betrayed and threw their support behind the pro-abolition Liberty Party candidate. The Democrat James Polk won the election. Texas became a state in 1845. In 1846, the United States negotiated with Great Britain to gain the lands that would become Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Great Britain took the Canadian province of British Columbia. Texas's entry into the Union and the attempt by Polk to buy California led to Mexico breaking diplomatic relations with the U.S. Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to provoke war with the Mexicans in 1846. On May 9th, Mexicans reportedly attacked Taylor's men, and Congress voted overwhelmingly for war. In Northern California, General John C. Fremont had begun an uprising. On July 14, 1846, they declared California independent and renamed the region the Bear Flag Republic. Mexico refused to surrender. Polk sent forces to capture Mexico City, which was taken in September 1847. Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2, 1848. Mexico gave the U.S. territory that would become California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Mexico accepted the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. In return, the U.S. paid a total of $18.25 million. Manifest destiny had been realized, but questions of whether the new land should be allowed to have slavery would soon lead the country into another bloody conflict. Question: what were the provisions of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? The answer: Mexico ceded to the United States the territory that now includes what are the states of California, Utah, and Nevada, as well as most of New Mexico and Arizona, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Mexico agreed to the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. The United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million and take over another $3 million of Mexican debt to the United States. Slavery and Western expansion. In 1846, Northern Democrats and Whigs passed the Wilmot Proviso, which proposed that in any territory the United States gained from Mexico, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist. Southern Democrats in the Senate refused to vote on it. Senator Cass of Michigan proposed the idea of popular sovereignty, meaning that the citizens of each new territory should decide for themselves whether or not they wanted to permit slavery. In 1848, a new political party, the Free Soil Party, was formed. Members opposed the spread of slavery onto the free soil of the Western territories. During the election of 1848, Free Soilers pulled votes away from the Democrats, allowing the Whig candidate Zachary Taylor to win. In 1848, gold was discovered in California. By the end of 1849, over 80,000 49ers had arrived in California. To keep order, Californians sought statehood. If California became a state, the free states would outnumber the slave states 16-15. A few Southern politicians began to talk of secession, taking their states out of the Union. Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky proposed a compromise that would allow California to become a free state if the rest of the Mexican cession could organize without restrictions on slavery. Also, Congress would be prohibited from interfering with the domestic slave trade and would pass a stronger law to help Southerners recover enslaved African Americans. President Taylor opposed the compromise. After his death in 1850, Vice President Millard Fillmore succeeded him and supported the measure. The Compromise of 1850 passed. Northerners were particularly opposed to the Fugitive Slave Act, which made it easy for anyone to accuse any African American of being a runaway slave and sent south. Besides the federal commissioners having a financial incentive to rule for the slaveholders, the act required federal marshals to assist slave catchers. These requirements drove abolitionists into open and active defiance. The Underground Railroad, an informal but well-organized network of abolitionists, helped many enslaved people escape to northern cities or Canada. Harriet Tubman, herself a runaway, was the most famous conductor. With the opening of the Oregon Country and the admission of California, many people pushed for a transcontinental railroad. The choice of the railroad's eastern starting point was a contentious issue. Southerners favored a southern route from New Orleans to San Diego. Northerners wanted the starting point to be Chicago. Senator Stephen A. Douglas wanted the railroad to start in Chicago. To win support, he eventually proposed to repeal the anti-slavery provision of the Missouri Compromise in the Nebraska Territory, and to divide that territory in two. Nebraska would become a free state, Kansas a slave state. Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. By 1856, Kansas had two governments, one opposing slavery and one supporting it. A territorial civil war soon began between settlers, and Kansas became known as Bleeding Kansas. Question: what was the Underground Railroad? The answer: the Underground Railroad was an informal but well-organized network of abolitionists whose goal was to help escaped enslaved persons reach freedom in northern cities or in Canada. The crisis deepens. The Kansas-Nebraska Act enraged abolitionists, mostly because it reopened the territories to slavery. It shattered the Whig Party as many members joined with Free Soilers and anti-slavery Democrats to form the Republican Party. The main goal of the Republicans was to prevent Southern aristocrats from gaining control of Congress. The Know-Nothings were another party to make gains in the 1854 congressional elections. The Know-Nothings were an anti-Catholic nativist party who opposed immigration. However, the Know-Nothings were divided over the issue of slavery, and the Northern Know-Nothings were absorbed into the Republican Party. Democrat James Buchanan, who claimed that only he could save the Union, won the presidential election of 1856. In 1856, the Supreme Court in Dred Scott v. Sanford ruled that enslaved people taken into free territories were still slaves. In part, the court stated that Congress's ban on slavery in the Western territories was unconstitutional. Democrats cheered the decisions, Republicans deplored it. Buchanan urged Kansas to apply for statehood, but there were major divisions between pro- and anti-slavery settlers. When the pro-slavery legislature passed a pro-slavery constitution, anti-slavery forces voted it down in a territory-wide referendum or popular vote. Finally, in 1861, Kansas became a free state. John Brown was an abolitionist who used violence to oppose slavery. He tried to incite an insurrection against slaveholders. When he and his followers tried to seize weapons at a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, a contingent of Marines led by Colonel Robert E. Lee forced his surrender. A Virginia court sentenced him to death. Question: why did the Kansas-Nebraska Act severely divide the country? The answer: the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise, which greatly angered Northerners who wanted to limit slavery. Northerners quickly moved to the territory to create an anti-slavery majority. Pro-slavery Missourians also hurried to Kansas. They voted illegally to elect a pro-slavery legislature. In response, anti-slavery settlers held a convention and wrote a constitution that excluded slavery. Then, Kansas had two governments. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was a turning point for the South. Southerners feared an African-American uprising and were angered that Northerners would arm them and encourage them to rebel. Republicans denounced John Brown's raid, but many Southerners blamed the Republicans since they opposed slavery. In 1860, the Democratic Party was torn apart by the debate over slavery in the Western Territories. Southern Democrats upheld the Dred Scott decision and supported slaveholders' rights in the territories. They wanted a federal slave code for the territories. Northern Democrats supported popular sovereignty. They did not want a federal slave code in the territories. The Democratic Party could not agree on a candidate for the 1860 election. Northern Democrats chose Stephen A. Douglas, who supported popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats chose John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. He was the vice president at the time. He supported the Dred Scott decision and a federal slave code for the Western Territories. The Constitutional Union Party was formed by people who wanted to uphold the Constitution and the Union. Their candidate was former Tennessee Senator John Bell. The Republican candidate was Abraham Lincoln. The Republicans campaigned against slavery in the Western Territories, against John Brown's raid, and for the right for the Southern states to preserve slavery within their borders. The Republicans also wanted higher tariffs, a new homestead law for Western settlers, and a transcontinental railroad. Lincoln won the election. The South saw his election as a victory for the abolitionists. South Carolina was the first state to secede. By February 1861, 6 more Southern states voted to secede. Crittenden's Compromise by Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky suggested several amendments to the Constitution. The amendments would guarantee slavery where it already existed. It would reinstate the Missouri Compromise line, extending it to California. Slavery would be banned north of the line and protected south of the line. The compromise did not pass. A peace conference was held February 1861 in Washington, D.C., but members failed to agree on a plan to save the Union. No secessionist states attended the conference. Seceding states met and on February 8, 1861, declared themselves to be the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy. The Confederate Constitution was similar to the U.S. Constitution, except it stated that each state was independent and it guaranteed the existence of slavery in the Confederacy. It also banned protective tariffs and limited the term of the presidency. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi was chosen president of the Confederacy. Question: in what ways did the Constitution of the Confederacy differ from the U.S. Constitution? The answer: the Confederate Constitution was similar to the U.S. Constitution, except it stated that each state was independent, and it guaranteed the existence of slavery in the Confederacy. It also banned protective tariffs and limited the term of the presidency.